Okay, let's unpack this. You probably just assume, right, that if your home's connected to a water system, pipes and all, you've got water flowing whenever you need it.
Yeah, like flipping a light switch. It's just there.
Exactly. But here's a pretty surprising reality. For more than 1 billion people worldwide, even with those pipes, the water doesn't flow continuously, not 24/7.
And this is what we call intermittent water supply, or IWS for short.
And it's not just, an inconvenience.
Oh, definitely not. The consequences go way beyond that.
Yeah.
When those pipes aren't constantly full under pressure, contaminants can actually get sucked in through leaks.
Right, so unsafe water quality.
Exactly. Which contributes to health problems. Plus, households end up having to cope.
Yeah.
They install expensive storage tanks, maybe buy water from other sources that might not be reliable. It adds a huge cost and burden.
So, okay, the global goal is clear. Continuous water supply, CWS. That 24/7 flow, that's the gold standard.
That's what everyone's aiming for, yeah.
But if you don't have that, if you're dealing with IWS, how do you actually measure it? How do you track if things are getting better, moving towards continuous?
Well, that's the real problem we're diving into today.
Yeah.
Because there isn't just one standard agreed upon way to report how continuous the supply is when it's not continuous.
Right. So how do we even know how intermittent it is?
Exactly. And the sources we're looking at tackle this head on. They compare two really different ways people try to measure IWS.
Okay, what are they?
So on one side, you've got the data the water utilities themselves report. Numbers they might track for their own performance or report to networks like the World Bank's IBNet, which gathers this kind of utility data globally.
Okay, the official utility numbers.
Right. And then on the other side, you have what people actually experience in their homes, what they report in big household surveys.
Like the demographic and health surveys, DHS.
Exactly, like the DHS. Those collect all sorts of health and population data, and they include questions about access to services like water.
Got it. Utility reports versus household experience. And this study we're looking at focuses specifically on Peru.
That's right. It compares these two data sources, the utility reports and the household surveys in Peru between 2010 and 2014. Looks at the whole country, but then, crucially, digs down into the regions.
And what did they find? At the national level, did the numbers match up?
Well, this is where it starts getting interesting. Nationally, for Peru during that time, the estimates of how many people had IWS were actually surprisingly close.
Really?
Yeah. The utility data suggested it was around maybe 20 to 21% of the population. And the household data, it put the figure somewhere between 23 and 26% reporting outages.
Huh. So looking just at the whole country, you might think, okay, they're telling basically the same story. Maybe a slight difference, but pretty close.
You might think that. But, and this is the really big finding, the major twist in the study, while those national numbers looked similar, when they actually broke it down region by region within Peru, the picture completely fell apart. A dramatic mismatch. In 21 out of the 23 regions they analyzed, the utility throbs for IWS just did not line up with what households were saying in the surveys. Not even close in many cases.
Wow. So complete disconnect at the local level.
Totally. You'd see regions where the utilities reported they were providing continuous supply or, very high hours of service.
But the people living there?
The households in that exact same region were reporting frequent water outages. And it went the other way, too. Regions where utilities admitted to having significant intermittency.
And the households?
The surveys suggested fewer households were actually experiencing outages than you'd expect from the utility numbers. It was all over the place.
So that tidy national average was basically hiding this huge, almost chaotic mismatch underneath.
Precisely. And the study points out that part of this complexity comes down to how you even define IWS. There's no single global standard for how utilities should report intermittency.
Right. What counts as intermittent?
Well, the UNICEF Joint Monitoring Program, the JMP, they use a threshold of less than 12 hours per day of supply to classify utilities as having IWS for their global tracking.
Okay, less than 12 hours a day.
So when the study applied that specific definition to the Peru utility data, the national estimate for IWS came out at about 21%, which lines up pretty well with the lower end of the household survey results.
Okay, that seems consistent then.
But wait. Then the researchers tried a different threshold using the same utility data. They asked, what if we define IWS for utilities as getting less than 16 hours per day?
So a slightly higher bar for what counts as good service.
Exactly. And just by changing that threshold from 12 to 16 hours, boom, The national IWS estimate based on utility reports jumped to 26%.
Whoa, that's a big jump just from changing the definition.
It is. And suddenly, that 26% figure aligns almost perfectly with the average national figure from households reporting they'd had an outage in the last 2 weeks.
Okay, so the definition really, really matters. Just changing it by a few hours shifts the national number by 5 percentage points.
It shows just how sensitive these measurements are. The definition you pick can totally change the story the utility data tells, at least at the national level.
And it's not just the utility side that's tricky, right? The study also looked closely at the household surveys.
Yes, they did. And they found issues there, too. Even inconsistencies within the same households when they answered slightly different questions about their water.
What do you mean, like contradicting themselves?
Kind of. It raises this really important question about what those survey questions are truly capturing. They looked at 2 specific questions from the DHS surveys in Peru.
Okay.
One asked households if their water was available for one whole day. Simple enough, right?
Seems straightforward.
Then another question, asked later in the survey, was whether their water supply had been discontinued for a day or more in the last 2 weeks.
Okay, slightly different phrasing. One about general availability, one about a specific interruption.
Right. And you'd think those 2 questions would basically measure the same thing, or at least correlate very strongly.
Yeah, you would.
But they didn't. Significantly more households said their water was available for one whole day than said it had not been discontinued for a day or more in the last 2 weeks.
Wait, say that again? More people said it was available all day?
Then said it hadn't been cut off recently, which seems contradictory.
It does. How can it be available all day if it was also discontinued recently?
Well, and this is the fascinating insight from the study. The question about the discontinuation, the outage in the last 2 weeks, seems to be a better indicator of the actual continuity of the pipe supply itself.
Better than asking if it was available all day. Why?
Because households living with IWS are incredibly resourceful. They adapt, they put in storage tanks on their roofs, they collect rainwater, they buy water from trucks.
I see. So even if the utility supply cuts out.
Exactly. Even if the tap connected to the utility network isn't flowing for hours, they might still tell a survey taker that water was available for one whole day because, well, they could get water from their tank or some other source whenever they needed it that day.
So available to them doesn't necessarily mean flowing from the utility pipe 24/7.
Precisely. But the question about whether the supply was discontinued seems to cut through that adaptation. It likely gets closer to capturing the network's actual intermittency, the breaks in service from the utility.
Okay, this is getting really complex. National numbers look okay but hide chaos. Regional numbers are all over the map. Even asking people directly gives different answers depending on the question.
It's a real measurement puzzle.
So why? Why are those regional numbers so out of sync? Why don't the utility reports match what people are experiencing on the ground in those specific areas?
Well, the study points to a few likely reasons. One big one could just be a lack of standardization in how utilities measure and report their hours of supply.
What do you mean?
Like, what are they actually counting? Is it the hours their pumps are running back at the treatment plant? Is it the number of hours they plan for valves to be open in a certain district? Or is it an estimate of the average hours water is actually reaching people's taps?
Those could be very different numbers.
Hugely different. And without a clear standard method, one utility reporting, say, 16 hours might mean something totally different from another utility in the next region reporting 16 hours. It makes comparing them really unreliable.
It's like everyone's using the term service hours, but measuring it with completely different rulers.
That's a good way to put it. Another key factor is that utility data often just gives an average for their entire service area. But water networks aren't uniform, right?
No, definitely not.
Think about it. Households way out at the end of the pipeline, or maybe at higher elevations, or just further from the main source, they're much more likely to get fewer hours of supply or lower pressure than people closer to the start of the system.
Right. The average doesn't tell you about the extremes.
Exactly. A utility might report an average of, say, 18 hours a day for their whole area. But that average could hide the fact that some neighborhoods get 247 supply, while others down the line only get maybe 6 hours.
And the household surveys might pick up that variation.
They might be better at it, yeah. Even though surveys have their own issues, like relying on people's memory, or maybe only being done during one season when supply might be better or worse, they do sample households across different parts of that service area.
Yeah.
So they might capture more of that on-the-ground variable experience within the network.
So the household survey, even with its imperfections, might actually paint a more realistic picture of the lived experience for many individuals compared to just a single average number from the utility.
It seems plausible, yes. It gets closer to the customer endpoint experience, warts and all.
And you mentioned this isn't just a Peru problem. Other countries see similar disconnects.
That's what the study suggests. They briefly mention comparisons with other places like Albania, Tanzania, Zimbabwe, where similar studies have found varying degrees of alignment or misalignment between utility and household data. It really points to this being a widespread global challenge in tracking IWS accurately.
Okay, and the study authors were upfront about their own limitations too, right?
Yes, which is good science. They acknowledge it's tricky to perfectly match a randomly surveyed household back to the specific utility serving them, especially in big cities or regions where multiple providers might operate.
Sure.
And also, just the nature of simplifying this complex reality of IWS down to just classifying a whole utility or a whole region as simply intermittent or continuous. That obviously misses a ton of nuance about the variation happening street by street or even house by house, depending on your exact spot in the network.
It's definitely a tangled web of data issues.
It is. But the study doesn't just leave us with the problems. It actually offers some concrete recommendations for how we could start to improve the way we measure this really critical service level.
Okay, good. Let's talk solutions. Given all these measurement headaches, what did the authors suggest could actually make things better? How can we get a clearer picture?
Well, a primary recommendation is pretty fundamental. We need to standardize how utilities measure and report those supply hours. There needs to be clearer guidance.
So define the terms properly.
Exactly. Yeah. Are we talking pump runtime, planned distribution time, or estimated hours received at the tap? They suggest utilities could potentially use data from their valve operators, the people who actually manage supply times in different zones, or incorporate customer feedback, like complaint logs, maybe even deploy sensors in the network.
Sensors sound high-tech. Feasible.
Well, sensors bring their own challenges, especially installing and maintaining them in systems where the pressure is going up and down all the time. But the core idea is consistency and transparency.
Be clear about what number you're reporting and exactly how you get it.
Precisely. Another really crucial point they make is about capturing the patterns of supply, not just dumping everything into a single average number of hours per day.
Ah, right. Because an average can hide so much.
Totally. An average of, say, 10 hours a day.
Yeah.
What does that actually mean for someone's life? Is it 10 hours every single morning, predictably? Or is it maybe 20 hours, but only every other day? Or maybe it varies wildly between the wet and dry seasons.
Yeah, knowing the pattern makes a huge difference in how you manage.
Immense difference. So they suggest reporting things like the number of days per week supplies available, or providing ranges for different times of year. That gives a much more useful, functional picture of how people actually receive and have to manage their water.
That makes a lot of sense. The pattern really dictates how you have to live your life around the water schedule, which I guess leads right into their third recommendation about predictability.
Absolutely. This is key, is the intermittent supply scheduled. And maybe even more importantly, is that schedule actually followed? Is it reliable?
Because knowing when the water is coming is huge.
It's critical. Even if it's only for a few hours a day, if you know when those hours will be, households can plan. They know when to fill their tanks, when they can do laundry, when someone needs to be home to manage it. Predictable intermittency, well, definitely not the goal, is something people can often manage.
But unpredictable outages.
That's incredibly disruptive, stressful. It forces people to scramble, maybe spend time and money they don't have seeking other water sources, or miss work or school because they're stuck waiting, hoping the water comes back on. So measuring the predictability or lack thereof is just essential for understanding the real impact IWS has on people's daily lives and well-being.
Okay, so moving beyond just a simple average hours number, we need standardized reporting, we need to understand the pattern of supply over time, and we need to assess its predictability. That sounds like a much more nuanced and ultimately more useful way to actually measure IWS.
Yeah, it really shifts the focus, moving away from just a basic utility output metric towards understanding the functional service level that the customer actually experiences.
Right. So let's try and wrap up this deep dive then. Looking at this data from Peru, what it really shows us quite compellingly is that even if the big national numbers for intermittent water supply from utilities and households seem kind of close.
Superficially similar, yeah.
The reality on the ground, when you drill down region by region, reveals these really significant widespread gaps and mismatches.
And that difference isn't just, statistical noise or small errors. It really points to some fundamental challenges in how we're measuring water supply continuity when that supply isn't continuous 24/7.
Yeah, the way utilities collect and report data often isn't standardized. It can hide huge variations in service within their own networks.
And even the household surveys, which might get closer to individual experience in some ways, they have their own complications. How you phrase the question matters, how people have adapted to gaps in service matters. It's complex.
And understanding these measurement problems is just so important. For you, listening, and for anyone working on improving global water access, why? Because you can't really track progress effectively towards that goal of continuous supply.
And you can't design the best strategies to actually help the billion-plus people living with IWS.
Unless you have accurate data that reflects their actual lived experience. If your measurements are off, your solutions might completely miss the mark.
Absolutely. And it leaves us with a really important question for you to think about. If those official utility reports often don't match up with what people are actually experiencing.
And even our best efforts to ask households directly run into these nuances and inconsistencies.
How confident can we really be about understanding the true scale and nature of the IWS problem globally? And when we talk about that goal of water being available when needed, what does that phrase truly mean? And how do we measure it properly when capturing that very idea of availability turns out to be this complicated?
It's a fundamental measurement challenge we really need to grapple with if we're serious about ensuring reliable, safe water for everyone, everywhere.